You're listening to the podcast series Introducing the Tanakh with Brooke Lester. This episode is Documentary Hypothesis, Introduction, with sources D, P, and J. This episode is going to be about Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis concerning the Pentateuch. When I say Pentateuch, I mean the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, also sometimes called the Torah, or here the Pentateuch. And when I say documentary hypothesis, I mean Wellhausen's hypothesis that the Pentateuch or Torah is a composite work, a composition of more than one literary or documentary source. Important to understand about Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis is that it did not spring out of nothing, and nor has it held a sort of monolithic sway over scholarship since. That is, Wellhausen worked among colleagues and predecessors who were also fashioning out documentary hypotheses for the composition of the Pentateuch, who had made the same basic observations that the material holds significant challenges for any theory of single authorship. It is, however, Wellhausen who has fashioned the hypothesis that, of all his peers, was held to have the greatest explanatory power. That is, it best explains the most of the available evidence in the Pentateuch itself. And at the same time, as of this recording, there's some 130 years since Wellhausen fashioned his hypothesis. And in that time, not only has considerable new data come to light, much of which lends itself well to support that it supports Wellhausen's hypothesis, and other material and also just fresh insights from later readers have posed significant challenges to aspects of Wellhausen's hypothesis. Although it speaks to the success of the explanatory power of Wellhausen's hypothesis, that some 130 years after he formulated it, it remains the hypothesis with which all other hypotheses must be in conversation. It's important to make both these caveats about Wellhausen's predecessors and colleagues, and also about challenges and criticisms to Wellhausen's hypothesis in this 130 years since. Because sometimes one wrongly gets the idea from people discussing Wellhausen in shorthand that he becomes a new dogma that replaces the dogma of single authorship, specifically Moses' authorship of the Pentateuch. So my hope in this episode is to show something of the explanatory power of Wellhausen's hypothesis, and at the same time to show where some of the work has gone on since the publication of his hypothesis about 1878. Among the warrants for a documentary hypothesis of the Pentateuch, one may begin with doubts concerning Moses' authorship of the Pentateuch. The idea that Moses authored the Pentateuch as a whole is itself a late tradition, first known to us in the writings of Philo and Josephus about the turn of the era. This is long after all of the Old Testament material and hundreds of years after most of it. The tradition that Moses authored the Pentateuch appears to come out of, for example, texts like Nehemiah 8 verse 1, Deuteronomy 31, 9 and 24, which talk about the Torah of Moses, the law of Moses, or the Torah of Moses. But what is this Torah of Moses? Torah means instruction. And it's well known that Moses is traditionally the one who brought the instructions of God in the form of the commandments and the laws down from Mount Sinai. By about the middle of the 3rd century BCE, the first 5 books of our current Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, had taken on a special status in Judaism, and although they mostly contain narrative with only short segments of legal material, they came to be called the Law or the Torah. And it's quite understandable that once you have biblical texts that talk about the Torah of Moses, that is the instruction of Moses, whatever it is that those texts refer to, once the Pentateuch as a whole begins to be called the Torah, it's understandable that that Torah is associated with Moses in that way. You already have the idiom, the Torah of Moses. This underscores for us, though, the observation that the biblical material, in fact, makes no explicit claim for Moses' authorship. The Pentateuch is not written in the first person, I, Moses, etc., etc., and neither the Pentateuch nor any other part of the Bible makes the claim that these books are from the hand or the mouth of Moses. Rather, this is a post-biblical claim that arises in the traditions. Even in those traditions, it was often questioned within both Judaism and Christianity on internal grounds. For instance, anachronisms, such as Moses' death in Deuteronomy 34, and then yet that's not the end of Deuteronomy. And this challenge would provoke such responses as, well, Moses knew what was going to happen, and so he wrote it down before he died, or maybe Joshua wrote in that part, and so on. But the problem is nonetheless clear. Similarly, the entire Moses lived before before monarchy arose among the people Israel, and yet the Pentateuch is aware that monarchy will eventually arise. So, for instance, Genesis 36, verse 31. Similarly, the sea peoples come along after Moses' death. We're thinking here of the Philistines, who become a threat only after the 12th century and are fought during the time, for example, of Saul and then of David. And yet the Pentateuch is aware that they will be coming along eventually, referring to land such as the way of the Philistines, the way that I might tell a story about a burial ground of the Aboriginal inhabitants of Illinois and say, it's over that way along by the 7-Eleven. That is, the 7-Eleven, of course, wasn't there at the time that the Native Americans built their burial ground, but I refer to the land in that anachronistic way out of my own later context. Again, these anachronisms can be explained or apologized for in terms of special revelation to Moses about the future and so on, but nonetheless, the difficulty of the material is there to be seen by any. Besides specific doubts concerning Moses' authorship of the Pentateuch, there are simply indications of other suggestions of editorial activity. So, for example, there are many narrative doublets. Beersheba and Bethel both have stories in which explain how they got their names, but both have two stories about how they got their names. Genesis 21:31 and 26:33, and then Genesis 28:19 and 35:15. Similarly, there's a story about how Jacob becomes named Israel, and then there is a different story about how Jacob comes to be named Israel. Genesis 32:28, 35:10. There are three tales in which the wife of the patriarch is endangered and passed off as the patriarch's sister, twice with Abraham and Sarah in Genesis 12 and 20, and once with Isaac and Rebekah in Genesis 26. All of these doublets and others like them suggest a situation in which multiple traditions about one event, or multiple traditions explaining one place name, for example, have been collected by an editor and put into a single narrative framework. And then there are just such infelicities as in Exodus 24, verses 9 through 18, Moses is going up the mountain, and he goes up the mountain 3 times without ever having come down 1 time, again suggesting editorial work with pre-existing sources. And finally, there are tensions among the material itself. For example, there are 2 creation accounts, Genesis 1:1 through 2:4, and Genesis 2:5 through verse 25, each with their own character and a different ordering of events. There are contrary statements within a single story, such as the flood narrative, wherein, for example, it is said that 2 of every kind of animal, clean, unclean, and birds of the air, are brought along. And then elsewhere it's said that 2 of every kind of the unclean animals, but 7 of the clean animals, for example, are brought along. One of these tales, that is, plainly presupposing that we needed enough pairs of animals to offer sacrifices. the other not imagining such a contingency. There I'm looking at Genesis 6, verses 19 and 20, and chapter 7, verse 2, and verses 8 and 9. Among the three principal law codes that we find in the Pentateuch, two of them are the Exodus law code and the Deuteronomy law code, and there are important differences between these law codes. On the subject of altars and how to build them, one can compare Exodus 20:24 with Deuteronomy 12:14. On the subject of the release of slaves, one might compare Exodus 21:2 through 1 with Deuteronomy 15, verse 12. On what the priest's rights are concerning sacrifice, one can compare Exodus 28:1 with Deuteronomy 18:7. On the proper preparation of the Passover lamb, Exodus 12, verses 8 and 9, with Deuteronomy 16, verse 7. Again, the only point here is that these are this counts as evidence against single authorship of the Pentateuch on the presumption that a single author would not offer such tension in details on these basic issues. Then there are the well-known issues about divine name. One can compare, for example, Genesis 4:26, which says that people began to call on the name of Yahweh during the primeval period in the time of Adam and Eve's children, with Exodus 6, verses 2 and 3, which makes the claim that the name Yahweh was not known to the ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but that God was only known to them as Shaddai. So, given all these warrants for some form of a documentary hypothesis as an explanation of the Pentateuch, what about Wellhausen's hypothesis? Well, many introductory students will have heard of the sources J, E, D, and P. J is shorthand for the Yahwist. Why J for Yahwist? Well, because in the German language, Yahweh is spelled with a J. So J for the Yahwist, and E for the Elohist, D for a source related to the book of Deuteronomy, and P for the priestly writer. Now, for Wellhausen, the D source and the P source served as his starting place. These were sources that had already, at least in their broad strokes, been discerned by Wellhausen's predecessors and peers. And so D and P were his starting place, and so I think they serve as a good starting place for us also. The D source of the Pentateuch is easily isolated because it exists only in the book of Deuteronomy, and it comprises the core of that book. Certainly the legal code of Deuteronomy 12:26, and perhaps also a part of the narrative frame that surrounds that core of laws and builds outward into the whole book of Deuteronomy. This core of Deuteronomy, the legal code with a part of its immediate narrative frame, is just stylistically different from everything else we find in the preceding four books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and is different in terms of many of its habitual theological claims and phrases. Most notably, the centralization of the cult, which is a major concern of this of the D source, as also are aspects of the institution of monarchy and issues concerning the temple and prophecy. All this despite the fact that the narrative frame, that is Moses standing on Mount Nebo before the people enter into the land, this narrative frame is pre-monarchical, pre-temple, just like the four books of narration that precede it. With its concern for the centralization of the cult in particular, the D source can be seen to be closely associated with the reforms of the Jerusalem king Josiah in the 7th century BCE. Those reforms are narrated in the Bible in 2 Kings chapters 22 and 23. And we can see that many of the concerns of those two chapters that is, the concerns that in those chapters are ascribed to Josiah's reform, coincide very nicely with what we find in this core of the book of Deuteronomy. And in fact, this core of Deuteronomy is held by many and probably most critical scholars to correspond to the book of the law that is said to come out of the temple in its renovations during the reign of Josiah, and which is said to form the basis of those reforms. In another episode in this series, we talk about the Deuteronomistic history, which is the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And in that episode, we talk about the what we call the double redaction theory of that Deuteronomistic history: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And that the first and principal redaction of the Deuteronomistic history, that is the history of the people Israel in the land, that first redaction is believed to be associated also with Josiah's reign and with those reforms. And so on a timeline, although we must distinguish between the D source, as we find it in the book of Deuteronomy, and the Deuteronomistic history, we find that we can pin them more or less together on the timeline. This D source and the first redaction of the Deuteronomistic history, that is the first redaction of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, in that 7th century BCE during the reign of the king of Jerusalem, Josiah, who sought to take down all the places that Yahweh was worshipped throughout the countryside of Judah and bring all of the sacrificial cult into Jerusalem and make only the temple in Jerusalem the legitimate place for sacrifice to Yahweh. An innovation in his time, something unprecedented before his reign, except insofar as it seems to have begun in some form 2 kings back during the reign of Hezekiah. A second source for the Pentateuch, which was under discussion during the time of Wellhausen, is what eventually would be called the priestly work. This work isn't united all in one place in the way that the D source is. With the 2 remaining sources, J and E, it exists only in the first 4 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. But no one of those books is entirely from the P source. Rather, the priestly material comes and goes over the course of those first 4 books, although the Bible begins with the priestly source in Genesis 1, and the Pentateuch as a whole will conclude, it is likely, with the priestly voice in the final verses of Deuteronomy, although that's the only place, as I say, where there may be a sign of the priestly source in Deuteronomy. Important characteristics of the priestly source that make it leap out from whatever other stuff is going on in the first 4 books of the Bible include the priestly writer's periodization of history. The major way in which the priestly writer breaks up history is into 3 covenants that are instituted after the creation of the world and of people. The first covenant with Noah in Genesis 9, in which Noah's line is blessed, and God covenants with Noah and with all creation under the name Elohim, and that covenant is given a specific sign. The divine warrior hangs his bow in the sky, signifying his retirement from battle. That is, when he says that he will not flood the world again in the way that he did in Genesis 6 through 8. The second covenant comes along with Abraham in Genesis 17. At which time God blesses Abraham's line, so it's a narrower covenant than that of Noah and all creation. There's this narrower covenant with Abraham. Abraham's line is blessed, and God covenants with Abraham under the divine name Shaddai, or El Shaddai. And this covenant also has a sign, and that sign is circumcision. And then finally there is a third covenant, yet more narrow than that with Abraham, the covenant with Moses, in which the line of Israel is blessed, Leviticus 26:9, and the God covenants with through Moses with the line of Israel under the divine name Yahweh, Exodus 6 verses 2 through 4. That covenant is also said to have a sign, the sign of the Sabbath, Exodus 31, verse 13, and verses 16 and 17. Just as the priestly writer's periodization of history dominates the narrative flow of the Pentateuch, so too we can see another way that the priestly writer dominates the Pentateuch when we see how an entire central section of the Pentateuch is made up of a section of legislation that begins in Exodus verse 19, verse 3, and runs all the way to Numbers chapter 10, verse 10. That is, it's the second half of Exodus, all of Leviticus, and the first huge chunk of the book of Numbers. This is effectively the entire center of the Pentateuch. And what is the overwhelming concern of this central section of legislation? But the tabernacle, as the place in which God is uniquely present amidst God's people. The tabernacle, because it's a big tent, sometimes called by the E source coming up later the tent of meeting. It's called by the priestly writer the Mishkan, or tabernacle. The tabernacle allows the presence of the most holy God amidst the people in at least two principal ways. One, it provides zones of holiness. There's the relatively holy outer courtyard, and then there's the holy inner space, and then there is the most holy space at the back of the tabernacle, the place so holy that that it's only visited by the high priest and only once a year at the time of Yom Kippur. See Leviticus 16 for the ritual. And the tabernacle is the place where the ritual cult of sacrifice is carried out, whereby the offenses of the people, these offenses which threaten to pollute the land in which Yahweh is present to Yahweh's people, these offenses are expiated through the ritual cult of sacrifice, cleansing the space in which God is uniquely present to God's people, and permitting this interface of that which is most holy with that which is relatively profane, that is the human sphere. One might think as an analogy with a nuclear power plant, for example, where there's this process underway that, if allowed to go out of control, would completely overwhelm the space, right? Runaway chain reaction. And yet you've got this activity going on. In the case of the nuclear power plant, it's the dampening rods and the control of the chain reaction to keep it down to a level that makes it fruitful rather than destructive. In this analogy, just as we have, the technicians of the nuclear power plant who are overseeing this interface between this enormous power and the human sphere, so in the temple we have the priests, who are the functionaries who oversee this cultic ritual sacrificial activity, permitting the presence of the most holy God to the people Israel. For Wellhausen, the priestly writer is essentially a narrator who is nonetheless also working with pre-existing sources and traditions. So, for example, we have all these genealogies, census lists, calendars, descriptions of correct ritual. All of these are part of the priestly material and appear to be the sorts of sources and traditions that the priestly writer is coming to the table with, as the priestly writer, for Wellhausen, narrates the history of the people Israel prior to their entry into the land. Beginning the narration, of course, with Genesis 1, the creation of the world, and continuing that narration through his covenants, through the giving of the law on Sinai, and all the way to the brink of the entry into the land. So you've got this distinctive priestly material, the distinct priestly narrative material, for example, the narration of the creation of the world in Genesis 1, or the narration of God's covenant with Abraham in Genesis 17, and so on. And then you also have the distinctly priestly sources that the priestly writer is working with, such as these genealogies, census lists, law codes, descriptions of ritual, and so on. And then all around this material and scattered among it, you have finally this leftover material, this stuff that you could characterize provisionally as simply not D, not P. That is, not Deuteronomy, which is entirely within the book of Deuteronomy, and not the priestly writer either, neither in his narrative voice nor reflecting his distinctive sources. It is that non-D, non-P material that Wellhausen would designate as J and E, and to which we now turn. For Wellhausen, what remains after you lop off Deuteronomy with its core of the source D, and after you isolate out from the first 4 books of the Bible everything that smacks of the priestly writer in his narrative voice and in his sources, what remains is a narrative of the history of the people Israel, which, like the priestly narrative, begins at creation, in this case with the story of Genesis 2, verses 4b through 25, or verse 5 through 25, and which is essentially of one voice, the voice that we would call J, or the Yahwist. Overwhelmingly J, but with some E. The sense is that we have basically a J narrative that at points has had a small amount of fragmentary E narrative material edited into it. So all of what we could call non-D, non-P for Wellhausen is this JE material, which itself is formed of 2 sources, J and a small amount of the fragmentary E material. Some characteristics of the J narrative is that it uses the name Yahweh for God, and it uses the name Sinai for the mountain of God. The Yahwistic material is comfortable with using anthropomorphic metaphors for God. God makes things with God's hand. God covers Moses' face with God's hand, and Moses can see God's backside after God has gone past in Exodus 34. God is directly available to people in an immediate, that is, unmediated way. For instance, God walks through the garden alongside of Adam and Eve, or appears directly to Abraham in Genesis 12. The J material betrays a Judean perspective. It's overwhelmingly concerned with southern locales. It pays attention to the tribe of Judah over the other tribes. And the way it describes God's promises to the ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, may be thought to anticipate Davidic fulfillment. That is, for example, the boundaries of the land and other details suggest that the promises to the ancestors are imagined in ways that would be comfortable to someone who is in love with the Davidic monarchy and perhaps the royal theology. Wellhausen dated J to the 9th century, that is to say, after the breakup of the kingdom in 922, although some later scholars would be more comfortable seeing J back in the time of Solomon's court or shortly thereafter. On the second part, in the second part of this episode, we will continue with the E source, comparing it to J, and then going on to look at some criticisms of Wellhausen's hypothesis and some idea of what's been happening in the documentary hypothesis since the time of Wellhausen.